Hello, this is Small Talk by Amanscoperta. I am Alessandra, and today we'll explore the topic distributed systems with messaging patterns with two great guests. So let me welcome Ian Cooper. Hello, Ian.
Hey.
And Oskar Dudycz. Hello, Oskar.
Hey, cheers.
Thanks both for accepting this invitation. So before we get started, just a quick information to people who are watching this live stream. This is a live stream, and then you can interact with Oskar and Ian during the conversation, just dropping your questions or feedback or anything you want to explore with them in the chat on YouTube and LinkedIn. So we will check the questions during the conversation, so feel free to ask whenever you want. But now it's time to start. So please, Oskar, I'll pass it to you. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Ian, welcome
Hey,
again.
Lovely to see you.
So let me try do a quick intro about you, just in case someone didn't know you. So for me, you are the man, the legend in the messaging and distributed systems. But for others, you are a polyglot coding architect. It's just it. Over 20 years of experience of what I know. I've been this year 18 years, so I'm also mature. So we can have a mature discussion today. And yeah, besides that, I think that you are all around. So messaging, distributed systems. I loved your talks about TDD, REST, etc. So plus the open source creator or Brighter. So that's my short intro, as short as I could. But would you like to add something more about you?
I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. It's interesting because when someone repeats it back to you, it's a little bit of a how are you both, test driven development dude and messaging dude and all these, and and really I think a lot of it in my life has been about solving problems that I've had from software that I've been using. And just wanting to share that experiences. So with messaging, I first sort of came across messaging back in late 90s, it would have been. And I was working for SunGard on a trading and risk system for mid-tier banks. And my boss came to me with a big, thick, ring-bound manual, because this is how we did things in those days, and said, Ian, this is the manual to IBM MQ series, and we need to be able to use, which I think became WebSphere, became something else. We need you to basically get our system to talk over MQ series. Good luck. And as is typical of IBM, the manual was really difficult and almost incomprehensible, so that you'd hire one of their consultants who would come in and actually have a whole lot of tools they could use. And it had wonderful little features like it would, whatever you typed in as the name of your queue, it would just uppercase it internally. So if you didn't use uppercase to refer to it, it would say queue doesn't exist, my friend. And so I was a bit lost. What the hell is this thing? I could figure out how do I send a message and receive a message, but at that point I was kind of like, yeah, and now what? So fortunately, I worked with a guy whose name was actually Marcus Rainbow. I know that sounds like Tom Bombadil's cousin or whatever, but his name was Marcus Rainbow, and he actually knew slightly more than I did about messaging. So we were able to talk about routers, brokers, all the kind of things that actually go into the world once you want to do something more than just something very narrow and point to point. And so that's how I really got into messaging. And then I think for me, once I'd initially cracked that egg open, then I began to understand how I could apply messaging in lots of work that I then went on to in my career after that. I think it's one of those things, a bit like when you learn HTTP. It's once you've acquired the skill, you feel very comfortable using it. It's just getting over that initial hump. Yeah. I mean, what was your sort of first
That's a good question. Definitely not as early as you. In late 90s, I was probably still playing on my Amiga 500. Um, I think that maybe it wasn't strictly about the messaging, but more about asynchronicity. Because my first language that I learned actually to program was the action script from Flash, because I was playing with those animation, etc. And action script was fully async driven, so you need to publish some event, like someone clicked something or the timeline was going, and then you need to handle that because there was no other way to react to those animations, etc. At first it was for me, because that I was like late high school, so for me that was a bit mind-blowing. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I think that kind of prepared also me for those next challenges. At least when I got to other async first stuff, then it was easier for me to reason about that. At least that's how I would say about it. So because then, yeah, because then I was really stuck, as probably most of us. So state-based driven world for many years when I started my, let's say, career. And yeah, so do you yeah, so what are your thoughts? What, because in theory we are now not in the late 90s, we are in a 21st century, and I think that all messaging discussions are always ending up in 70s and saying like, yeah, Allen Key got it in 70s. So why we are like in a 21st century and we still need to talk about messaging, and why is it not commodity in your opinion? Why are we still, living in like preferring this sync-based communication?
So it's a really interesting one, right? And so when I teach my workshop, right, I teach 2 days, and the first day is to catch everybody up, right? Which is to say, I need to teach you how to do messaging between two systems. So we just go through the basics: message pump, what a message is, what a channel is, some basic ideas like routers and brokers, just to get everyone on one page. But the whole second day is about how do I use that to build an architecture that is asynchronous. And I think that's one of the hard bits is, what is an asynchronous architecture? How does that differ from what I might understand? And the second, I'll come back to that one in a second. And the second one, which I think you and I talk about, and I've seen you talk about a bit more on some of your newsletter, is we layer a lot of semantics on top of messaging that is not visible inside messaging middleware or often the code that we write. So you and I might talk about commands and events, or messaging versus eventing, or all these kind of terms, but it's not really visible, right? And I think the complexity of we have to layer this whole set of concepts across is quite hard. It's a little bit, by analogy to me, the way that it's very easy to understand the principle that I'm communicating via HTTP, but REST is a lot harder because suddenly I'm building a whole lot of concept on top. One of the advantages I think I have, just referring to the first bit of the conversation, is, and I do actually do a whole section on the second day. Well, what I do is I say, okay, let's kind of go back almost to the 1980s and talk about basically paper-based offices, and how in paper-based offices, which I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to experience when I was at university, because I was on the cusp of the first computing revolution. And I used to work in offices where there were some computers, but a lot of it was still data entry of our, etc. And everything was essentially your inbox, your outbox, and a mail cart. I even worked in the mail room at one point. So I've been destined for messaging ever since basically I started my career. And those businesses operate mostly asynchronously, right? A piece of work arrives in my inbox, I pull it off, I do some activity, I put it in the outbox. There's a synchronous part where I'm working away doing the activity. And sometimes in some roles I had, that might require me to make a synchronous operation, like a phone call. Like I did one thing where I did some work for an insurance company where I had to check on people's money for their life insurance had failed to be paid that month, and I could phone their bank. Synchronous. So you get, investigate this case, bit of synchronous work, bit of async work, but it was all flowing like that. And actually, if you look at, what you and I probably think of as the Bible of kind of messaging books, which is Gregor's enterprise integration patterns, and Bobby Wolf as well. Many of the terms like routing slip, etc., come from things that basically live in that world. So I actually show my class a picture of a routing slip in case none of them have ever seen it. And I actually dealt with real routing slips, right? And so that whole model definitely is quite powerful. And I sometimes say, think about how you would model this business if you did not have computers, if you only had paper, inboxes and outboxes and mail cards. And actually then you can begin to think about that flow. But I think that's the hardest part. But I have reasoned that for those younger than me, the other analogy which is really useful to them is that the way we communicate now, our messaging on apps, right? That's the other thing to think about, is that a lot of your communication day to day is asynchronous, and you're very happy with that. And this fear people have of, but if I ask for something and the response comes back later on another channel, how will I build a system like that? You live like that all the time, right? With quite a delay when someone isn't present, and you function around that. So figure out how you do that, right? And that is, I think, the problem.
Yeah, I think that it's a bit counterintuitive that on one hand, as you said, for business, it's usually like if you ask them, okay, so what if that happens, or how does it work in reality, like on paper? Then they say like, yeah, then we are sending some email or sending some message or calling that specific guy. And for them, when you ask them, what if it's with a bit longer delay, then usually it's not an issue. But of course, if we ask them like, okay, but we will get the eventual consistency, then they are scared. So do you think that it's only about like using a specific metaphors or language in explaining those like real issues, or is it something more than that? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that I think there are genuine things you have to take into account, which are different to where if you work synchronously. There's a paper by, I think, Waldo and Emerson, which is about, I can't remember its name now, something like on distributed systems, where they talk about basically the way that people gravitate towards RPC style things. Mm-hmm. And they say effectively that essentially the purported reasoning is really that people are very used to writing a program, which is a series of kind of function calls. And so what translates best from, hey, I want to call a method and get a response, but I want to do that remotely, is it to look like a function call but be remote. So even though, HTTP APIs are not strictly RPC, right? But it's still a very similar feel. So I guess to the average developer that once you learn, when you begin to program that kind of workflow, it seems very obvious that kind of sequential logic, I'm doing something is very easy to implement. And the problem you get into slightly with stuff that's asynchronous is I do something and then timing wise later there is a response, or I query something and maybe that information is not there yet. And that essentially does require you to think a little differently. And I think that problem of critical thinking about that problem is quite important for people to make that transition to messaging. But I wouldn't want to, because back when I started, OO languages were quite established, but there was a period I'd hear about from older colleagues when, procedural shifted to OO, where people literally said, many of these procedural programmers will never be able to understand object orientation. They will have to leave the industry, right? And it was like, that's just weird. Surely people can think about objects, otherwise what's the point of them? So I think that people can reason about asynchronicity. And as you say, I think if you think about the real world, but I think that is the problem. It is, we don't train developers to think about asynchronicity. because then you also get into things like workflows, durable execution, all those things begin to pop up at certain points, right? But actually the basic idea of I send a message, but I may get a reply a bit later. I think if you can master that and you can begin to see how I build systems around it, you get lots of doors open, but that is the challenge, I think, is people have to get past that point.
Yeah, I think that it's also a bit of a feeling of losing control, because if you have this RPC, then it's like I'm in control because I'm in charge. I'm asking, requesting something, and then of course someone can reject it, but then at least I know. But then if we are if we are letting it go, because that's actually what we are doing, then we are not anymore in charge. So I think it's quite natural for us as humans.
I know there's a really interesting little dilemma that pops up here, right? So when we talk about microservices that use messaging, one of the things we like to say about it is this is really great because I've got true independent deployability, because I can just check that I'm sending messages that match the contract, right? And I can check that if I receive a message that matches the contract, I'm correct. I can test myself in isolation, and off we go. And people, and in theory, that's great. But then people get very worried, right? I want to run the whole system. I want to see how my thing works along with the other thing. And, people get very freaked by the idea of I'm creating a service that has these capabilities, and I don't really need to understand how everybody consumes and uses me, because they want to feel the flow of everything, right? And that is quite hard to feel you are so isolated. So I think that is also part of it. And for testers particularly, this idea that I'm not testing end to end the whole time. Well, in theory, liberating, we can work on that service. It's also quite a shock at first to say to people, you don't have to worry about that, just test your contracts.
Yeah, so going with this, so as you are one of the creators of the popular messaging tooling, then do you think that it's also a matter of the tooling we are giving to people? Because maybe because for instance, in a .NET space, as Brighter is, then there is a lot of competition, positive competition, because people can choose from multiple tooling, but not in all dev stacks there is so much let's say choice and helpful. So do you think that it's also a matter of tooling that doesn't give enough I got you, I'm holding your hand, so I will drive you step by step? So what are your thoughts? So is it also about tooling and how much stuff it requires to learn, or to get better maybe adoption of those messaging patterns and approach?
So I think that I think that the competition is useful, right? And because it basically creates new ideas and it pushes people to try better approaches to things. So I think that is definitely a useful way of approaching that problem. But I don't think necessarily it is diversity of stacks. I think the problem is more, how do we present messaging to you as a user? And part of that is typically in a messaging framework, you've got a message pump and you've got a handler, right? And a handler handles something. And then what a problem I think is that some of it is, well, how do all these handlers, if I've got more than one thing, fit together to give me some organized notion of how this actually works to solve business problems? And I think some of that we leave a little bit to, I mean, there are things like Saga patterns, etc., but I don't know whether they're necessarily, because they tend to be focused on the transactional nature of things, a way of really understanding how that flow works. So I think there's generally a problem of comprehensibility. And in fact, we were talking with Clemens Fasters about async API, right? So I love async API, great way of documenting your endpoint. But the thing that async API doesn't really give you is when a message enters my app, what happens? I may be able to, by inference, figure out that there's basically something that says do this, and there's something that says this thing was done, right? But I don't necessarily know what the connection and the path is in between. So some of that I think is a bit of a problem we need to solve. And so I quite often fall back on things like BPMN diagrams, etc., to show people basically what's actually happening here. But I think that piece, and I talk about this on the second day, I talk about BPMN diagrams and ways of effectively understanding that flow. But I think understanding of that flow inside is a problem. And I don't know if even many of the messaging frameworks really have solved that problem particularly well. We're going to have a bit of a stab at it, I think, next year in Brighter, effectively giving you something that basically shows you flow a bit better inside. I think if you look towards workflow engines and how processes get automated, that is effectively more where interest in that kind of problem space occurs. But there is this crossover at some point between what we do in messaging and kind of embedded workflows, etc., and those ways of representing the flow of information. As practical advice for people, one of the things I recommend is that you do figure out with people something like a BPMN diagram to figure out what's happening inside processes, what the choreography is between processes. Try and represent that diagrammatically, and then figure out which bits lie in which process. If there is a complicated enough workflow, is there some means of controlling that? You can start out with just having handlers. If it gets complicated, you've got branching logic, different conditions. Do you need something to recognize that? And that crossover between automating business processes and event-driven architectures is something we don't always tie together well enough, I think.
Yeah, I think that also we, as a tooling creators and maybe in applications, we are also having a bit of challenges with, connection between modules or bounded context, whatever we call it, because of what I saw, that's one of the scariest part for people, because as you said earlier, that most of us, when starting, we are looking on the messaging that it's on the other receiving end. So like the end of the process. And quite often processes are spanning between multiple places, and then they can, if we model it right, break complex process into smaller, more understandable pieces, but also they can increase coupling if we don't embrace that. We should also have some split between those types of messages. So for instance, what like data on the inside and data on the outside. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have some something to maybe? I know that it's like with one liner, it's hard to give some recommendation, but how do you deal with, at least trying to find those boundaries and dealing with them?
So in terms of finding boundaries between services, I tend to basically look at processes and business processes. When you think about architecture, the real danger effectively for me is entity services. So if you're just thinking about things that are listed as a kind of entity with CRUD-based operations, that won't work well in a messaging environment, because messaging tends to work much more like old school data flow architectures, where effectively you have a flow of information, you have a flow of data passing between transformational nodes. People always think about Unix as a kind of example, but there's also things like flow-based programming, which is by Paul Morrison, which is a very good kind of way of thinking about this stuff. So there's lots of older thinking about how you do flow-based programming. And the trick with flow-based programming, effectively, etc., is that these are kind of transformational items. So that's what I would tend to recommend, is you think about your world in terms of a world of processes rather than entities. And then effectively it's very much easier, which is kind of the old school office analogy again. to think about the idea of data arriving, being transformed, and then spat out the other side. So for nowadays, I work for Just Eat Takeaway, which is across Europe, different local brands. And the thing about basically what we do is it's quite an asynchronous process, right? So what we do is we deliver food or groceries, etc., to people's houses. So it's fairly straightforward for people to actually get into the right mindset, because they can think about the fact that somebody places an order, and there are a series of process steps, including, like, you know, someone cooking it, someone picking it, a courier being dispatched, etc. And what you need to think about is the flow of information, right? So rather than having a thing where I keep going back and updating an order inside a central entity-based repository, what you need to think about is the order is the thing actually flowing across that workflow. Okay, and that I think is where you transition between thinking about systems that are designed for a more synchronous approach, where I have entity state living in given services, to thinking about processes with data flowing between it. And flow is a really important kind of concept to get your head around. And so that's, again, something I talk about a lot on my second day, is basically how do you move to architectures that basically think about flow rather than architectures that are thinking about updating an entity, because that is key to succeeding messaging, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's like, if we model process well, then at least this is what will be working. And then when we have this process modeled and understood, then we can think how we can optimize them, but by chunking it or grouping or whatever. So that's quite similar. So I personally, I watch a lot of your talks, and I always wanted to ask you that question, but somehow didn't yet. So now it's my time, because for me, they usually have the good balance between the practicality and the theory. And I always respect, especially also as a person that is giving talks, that you are always doing your homework, so you are always prepared. So how could you shed some light, or how are you learning, or how are you preparing talks and also workshop? Because you know, quite often talks that I see are entertaining, but after that I realized that, yeah, I didn't learn anything new, or you know. And your talks are, for me, like, always grounded with research. So I'm curious, how are you?
So typically, typically I'm talking about things that I'm experiencing. So I think I tended to have a theory some time ago that one of the best ways to deliver a good talk was to deliver it based on experience of doing a thing, right? So when new things come out, there's always people that will want to talk about, here is the new thing, right? But often those talks can be a little bit Diet Coke, right? That they taste good for a bit, but afterwards it doesn't really leave you with anything. And I think part of the issue there is just that there's no experience to ground how it will actually work for you in reality. So I typically tend to talk about things where I've experienced that, and often I use as a trigger for a talk, what do I see people around me where I am, or I talk to at community events, or I know, what are we struggling with? What are people finding difficult? What solutions do I have? What solutions do other people have? And I will go away and figure out from that how I can present back what solutions I've got to those problems and how that stuff works. So typically that is my process for a talk, is to say, where is the struggle? What solutions do I have to the struggle? And sometimes I will sit on a topic for ages because I know there's something worth talking about, but I don't have a solution to that struggle yet, right? I only have the struggle, and that isn't so helpful. So workshops, I think, I teach my workshop. I teach internally as well here. I think I'm doing about 4 times this year. So it's kind of, how do I plan a workshop? What I really want there are 2 things going on for me with a workshop. One is, how do I get everyone up to the same speed? And that's also true in a talk. How do I get everyone up to the point where we can all understand the problem together? So you've got to do that to begin with. Some people that means some people it's going to be a bit like, okay, I'm doing this, but it's a refresher. And then with that grounding of that information, how can we then basically apply that to solve actual problems? And that's what I would then focus on. That's my focus across those 2 days, typically. Yeah. But yes, typically it's something that I understand. It's something that I'm experiencing. It's something that I have tried to figure out how we solve.
Yeah, because for instance, I don't remember the title of the talk, but you had this talk with, you mentioned this event flow and different modeling strategies and techniques. So that was definitely well researched. I don't think that it's like, or maybe you are thinking like every day on all those nitty gritty, but that was quite impressive.
Yeah, it's a mix. I think typically what would happen is that I have thought about stuff, but then I need to go. I mean, people always say the act of writing a presentation or a workshop tends to result in you picking up on a whole load of stuff, where effectively, in order to explain it, I now have to fill in the gaps. In order to explain it, I had to do some more research. I think so. I saw someone talking about writing a book the other day, saying I thought it would be fairly straightforward to basically get this information down, and then as they began to basically try and write it, they're like, oh, but I wonder what that is. Am I sure about that? Oh, I better check on that, because so I find, for anyone thinking of writing presentations or workshops, it is a powerful act for you as well, because what it does is it forces you to lay out a narrative about something, and as a result of that, you will end up with a better understanding of it yourself.
Yeah, that's a similar strategy. I heard from someone that if you want to master something, then the best way is to teach someone else about it. So that kind of works for me. And I'm curious, like, because I didn't yet join your workshop. So is it like on your workshops are having the similar layout as your talks? Is it like a mixture of the practical exercises and the theory? How do you balance that, or what people should expect from it?
So the first day, mostly sort of the second half, the afternoon, effectively, like the first day, is all practical exercises. That's why the first day is about getting you into messaging. So we do all the practical exercises of getting you to connect two things together, talk to them by messaging. The second day is more about the architecture side of it. So it's given I know how to send something between two pieces, how do I do the architecture side of it? So there's no coding exercises on the second day. It's much more talking about how we think about messaging flowing the system. So thinking versus coding. Generally, my experience would be by the end of the first day, if I've written code for a whole afternoon, most people are quite happy not to write code again on the second day. But, I occasionally have some optional exercises where I go, you can do this other exercise if you want, and I don't usually get many takers. But yeah, that's the way kind of structure it. But I mean, what I really think, what I really would hope to give people is that greater understanding of, I've got this idea, which is that messaging is good because effectively I have now temporarily decoupled these two services, so that I have this notion that I am not dependent on the uptime or even existence of that other service. I just need to worry about the existence of my own service. And that is good, but that bigger question of how do I build a system around that? What is the semantics of whatever of the message I'm sending mean, right? Am I invoking an operation in something else? Am I distributing data that other people basically want to work with? And that effectively is where I think the hard part lies. But I think what it's like, I feel like at some points it's like a switch that flips, and once you can flip that switch, life gets a lot easier, really.
Yeah. Plus, it's a bit addicting because when you start, then it's hard to unlearn that. Yeah. So if you if someone asks you like, why should I join your workshop, or in other words, to make it again to the main topic, like why should I use messaging or should even consider doing that compared to what I was doing. So let's say traditional, I wouldn't even say REST based, by HTTP based communication, like synchronous. So what would you say, like which challenges would someone could solve more efficiently or easier, or have the life daily life easier? So what would you say?
So I think, I mean, partially it's this idea, I mean, I think it's the reactive architecture manifesto, and that's a little bit where it comes from. But it is this idea that if you build an architecture based on message passing, some things become a lot easier. And one of them is that you can build much more elastic and resilient services that you can deploy more rapidly, which effectively is much easier to live with. And I saw Barry O'Reilly talking, I think at DDD Europe, talking about how, even back as far as Parnas, the idea that breaking up systems by entities rather than by breaking them up by processes, by the flow of things that basically move through stuff, was actually much harder, and it causes you much more grief. Breaking up a system into processes and treating them as a graph is a lot easier than treating them as entities, right? And you, I mean, look, you can even see that if you go and look at the average agent that's taught LLM, right? All of those now are starting to have workflows of agents and sub-agents distributing work amongst themselves. And while few of them have truly embraced messaging, which I expect they will do at some point, you can see that people think that way of working is easier, right? Even for machines. And I think overall, it's just easier for you to work with.
Yeah, I agree. And also I would add that I think that thinking about systems this way, so in like message passing or event based, is weird for us as engineers, because that's how we were taught for many years. And for me, when I'm trying to explain to my family like what is event driven architecture or event sourcing, because they are asking me, Oskar, what are you doing? Then when I'm explaining that I'm trying, then it's usually like, aha, because for them it's a no-brainer. They don't understand why, when we are building systems, we don't care about business processes quite often. For them it's obvious that's the place where we should start be doing it, but so they don't understand that it's anything fancy or let's say different than how we should be doing that since the beginning.
Should we have a look at one or two of the questions that are mounting up alongside, Oskar?
Yep. So would you like to read some, or I can read it?
You can pick your favorites. Come on.
Okay. So I think that inside out we covered.
I'll take the async KPI one. While you're having a look, I'll take the async KPI one.
Okay.
I do use it. We use async KPI here. I like async KPI because I think that it solves a problem which we get as an organization grows large enough, which is, how do I know how to get hold of this event? How do I know what operations you expose that I can invoke? And without something like async KPI and some registry of those documents that surfaced in some way, it's basically, I ask questions in Slack, like, does anyone know where this message comes from? Or effectively, I search GitHub, right? And neither of those are particularly effective. So async KPI is a great way to open your endpoint, same way you would open API. What we use it for actually is a bit more than that. So we use it to provision the queues and topics that or streams that you might need. And so because we can take that async KPI document, parse it, we can take the schema out, we can register it, we can look at your channels. And if you use some of the custom bindings that relate to protocols, we can actually go and give you a Kafka topic, etc. And we go and do that on the back end. We do some stuff with Pulumi. And that all effectively means we can just turn on your infrastructure. It also means that we don't have to deploy all of your services in order to actually stand our infrastructure up again if we need to. So async KPI is very useful. I think what it's missing is something comes in, something goes out, or how does the flow work across this stuff? I'm told, I haven't looked at it yet, I'm told Aratso. So Aratso is the other spec from the folks who open API for that's showing you the workflow of how you integrate all these HTTP APIs. I'm told that Oratio is going to do something for async API to show you what your flow is, which will be awesome.
And are you also using event catalog yet, or haven't got the chance?
We use it a little bit, yeah. And in fact, we had some folks internally who did some contribution towards event catalog. But yeah, so ideally what you want with async APIs, event catalog and any others, that essentially you want that tool chain, right? You want the tool chain of being able to understand your flows and your messaging better, and that's why it's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. So I will ask the question from Bartek. We talked a bit about data insight and data on the inside and data on the outside, but Bartek has a bit more detailed question. So what is your experience and patterns are anti-patterns for private public boundary of service module component according messaging and other integration patterns? So he also followed with that he sees a lot of issues with the CDC pushed by some tooling creators. We know which one.
Yeah.
And so what would you say about it?
Okay, so the first thing is definitely there is basically, yes, you need outside data, and it shouldn't couple to your inside data. In other words, if I change my internal to domain model, it shouldn't immediately change the data on the outside. You can do that fairly straightforwardly with most messaging frameworks without writing tons of DTOs and everything else. Basically, you've probably got a mapper so Brighter comes to think of a message mapper that effectively just maps between your type and whatever the wire representation you want is with, I think, a message mapper, right? I think that's quite important because it means you can iterate internally without changing your messaging. Your message is a contract with the outside world. The danger with CDC is people plug it in and there's no control basically for the team that owns it as a way of effectively saying, okay, but this message is just a mapping of something internally and then I'm going to push it outside. And often the problem with CDC, I think, is when I see it really abused is like someone from the data side who wants to suck all your data in basically via Kafka, just hooks up CDC, exposes Kafka right off your data store. And it's kind of like, wow. And contextually, it often doesn't make any sense because you've only got the contextual thing that in the table may not make any sense actually as a message. So I am very much in favor of sending a message explicitly when you can, and doing that via some kind of transactional outbox pattern. And even if you have let's say, where you want to use the model of having your outbox built from the transaction log of the data store, what I recommend actually is that you take that transaction log from the store, you listen to it, you write that to the outbox, and then you actually send the message from the outbox. So that gives you still that layer of mapping between what is in your table and effectively what you communicate to the outside world, because it may not be the same thing. And so I understand it. So it feels like a quick way to get messaging done, all these kind of connectors, but it's brittle. And the problem with messaging is that it, like any contract, it is brittle if you do that, right? Same way that you wouldn't necessarily want to output your domain model in a way that basically meant every time you change a domain model, your external API automatically changed, right? For HTTP, right? So I think that's definitely a problem. In terms of boundaries, so yeah, I'm fairly protective of. The team has a different boundary. There's an interesting thing we don't talk about enough in domain-driven design communities, which is really about what I think sometimes people call an integration boundary, bounded context rather. That effectively there's your bounded context, which is the inside of your service, and then there's basically this layer where effectively there are API contracts which are more long-lived and may actually be a slightly different model. And some folks call that an integration bounded context, which is to say, there is reasoning about that data in that space as well, and you may share it with neighborhoods, etc. I think it is important to reason about the data that you are sharing outside. The other thing is, inside, it's a great paper, data on the inside versus data on the outside, because it does also cover things. So we use quite a lot, which is event carrier state transfer, where essentially when I I don't necessarily want to ship the whole database with every message. So sometimes I may want to particular reference data, just you send a message with an identifier, and I assume you have another means of looking it up. And in fact, flow-based programming has them, calls them lookup tables. So for us, my current place, right, I don't want to send you all the details of a store with every message. It's fairly fixed. If you need something other than the ID of the store, which is not, in most cases, most people don't. They don't need to look up the address for their operational. They just need to know what the ID is. But if you did, well, you can just listen to a stream and then effectively create a local cache, a forward cache that used to be called, basically, of that data, which you can then use as a lookup when you receive a message that has only a store ID, and you actually need to furnish yourself with more details. You can also do that by content enrichment. You can actually have a pipeline, and you can say, in this pipeline step, I want to actually take the message that basically only has ID, add in the details, and then pass it on to the other one. They both amount to pretty much the same sort of thing. But yeah, that is what I would talk about in data on the outside versus data on the inside.
Yeah, regarding this, let's say, event with the link or message, then as always, there is a nuance between that and the thin line between the good practice and bad practice, because as you said, it can be a perfectly fine good practice, especially if the data is like personally identifiable data, then you don't want to share that so you're doing what you should. But in many cases, it can also end up with, I'm calling that a clickbait event. So it's like forcing you to check for something, and then you read and you see, it's not yet there. So
yeah. So I tend to think about my message should have all the things the message needs, the things that are things that message cares about. I try and avoid transitive dependencies. So things that belong to other systems, where if I had them embedded in my schema, for example, whenever that changed, that would be a problem. So a classic example for us would be, I need to know where the customer's address is to deliver to them. Actually, we don't look it up of the customer ID. We just include that in the message, because it's part of the context of that message is where will I deliver it, right? So it doesn't make sense to say that is not part of this, because effectively it doesn't matter if I have a slightly different format for the message, because whatever I've done when I sent the message, I just added it in that format. But if what I was going to do is include a large body of the catalog data, for example, for a restaurant or grocer, that would be crazy to include that everywhere all the time. And there are better ways to look that up. It's a bit like database design, right? It is, in the sense of there are sort of strict rules, and then there's just reality of what makes sense in terms of locality, move the data close to the point of processing, and actually I'm creating something of overwhelming. I'm coupling you to things that actually you don't care about by doing that.
Yeah, I agree, because if we first need to learn rules and practices, and then need to know where to skip them, because otherwise we, instead of data mesh, we will have data mess, which is a common case. Okay, Ian, do you want some final questions, or do you have some final thoughts for the audience? Or anything
I was going to comment
we didn't cover?
One that I saw flash by, which is about CDC, and actually it's a bit more of a question stroke answer, right? So you can tell me. I've never found that patch-like tools for contract testing of messages are particularly great. So we tend to fallen back now on static schema registry based confirmation that you conform to the schema and that you are backwards, forwards, compatible, etc. as appropriate, or literally just saying something like, okay, if I want to check that basically you consume a message, I can fake it in with command line tooling, etc. So it'd be interesting if anyone's got any better solutions, because I've not, outside of schema registry checking, not really found anything that isn't so clunky developers stop using it. So it's definitely a good question. It's a good question. I just don't have an answer, but I would be interested in I think it's a good conversation for the community to have.
Yeah, I think that for my personal experience, I agree that those contract testing tooling that I know are quite heavy. and they require a lot of effort upfront to set them up and then to maintain. Usually in my projects, I was using a simpler way, so like snapshot testing, so storing some snapshots and then checking whether we are forward and backward compatible. And if you have already schema registry running, then definitely they have some sort of capabilities for that, or using mixture. But I was also using usually something that was handmade for the specific project. Nothing like in as a general. Of course, there are tools like Pact, etc. I know that many people are quite liking it. For me, I like the idea, not necessarily how hard it is to run it.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Practically, we started up a few Pact servers and not really seen them used. So and definitely for messaging, because there's not like a single protocol like HTTP, but a range of protocols. It never felt quite as successful. But it's definitely an interesting one. I think it's a challenge for somebody who might be able to write themselves a decent product. Perhaps AI will solve the problem for us. Perhaps we need to write agents that will basically interpret the messages for us and check them. Who knows? Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Oskar. That was lovely chat.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian.
So thank you both, and thank you also to all people who ask questions. And see you then in Berlin with Oskar and Ian. And so I want to, just let you know that there are still some seats for Ian's workshop in Berlin. So here's the QR code, or just drop us an email if you want to get more information about that. And then I thank you both again for your time and for all the valuable insights you share today, and see you to the next one. Bye.
Thank you, Alessandra, for invitation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
And I wasn't joking. Yeah, I wasn't joking when I was saying that Ian is the man, the legend. So if you're in Berlin, join him.
Thanks, Oskar.